is happening right now. But this time, it's not superpowers going head-to-head. Nope, it's private companies building these incredible reusable rockets and making serious plans for missions to Mars. But here's the wild part. They're all operating under a set of rules written way back during the Cold War, a time when space was a totally different ballgame. So the big question is, how do these old rules possibly hold up in this crazy new reality? Let's dive in and find out. You know, this quote from the legal philosopher Roscoe Pound just hits the nail on the head. It perfectly captures the challenge we're looking at. How on earth do you apply stable, foundational laws to an industry that's moving at like warp speed? That's the core tension we're going to unpack here. This massive struggle to make the old laws of the cosmos fit this new commercial gold rush to the stars.
All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to start with what's called Space Law's Golden Age. Then we'll jump into the new commercial space race. We'll look at who's actually regulating the rocket launchers and what happens when things go wrong, like satellites falling from the sky. We'll also tackle that blurry line between airplanes and spacecraft. And then finally, we'll look ahead to the future of space law.
Okay, first up, we've got to rewind the clock way back in the beginning. Space wasn't about business or profit, not at all. It was all about national power, about prestige. And so the rules that were written back then were really designed for one thing, to keep the peace between the US and the Soviet Union in this brand new, very high-stakes arena. And things moved fast, really fast. In 1957, Sputnik 1 launches and basically shocks the entire world, kicking off the space race. Right away, the UN sets up a committee to make sure space would be used for peaceful reasons. And all that led directly to the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. You can think of it as the Constitution for the Cosmos. And if you look at this treaty, it's just packed with idealism. Space was declared the province of all humanity. You couldn't just plant a flag on the moon and call it yours. And this part is absolutely critical. States, countries, were put on the hook for everything that happened up there, whether it was a government mission or a private one. They even gave astronauts this really special status as envoys of mankind. Okay, but let's be real. That idealistic, government-run world, it's not the world we live in today. The space race of the 21st century is all about private money, relentless innovation, and yeah, of course, the search for profit. And it's that huge shift from national pride to private enterprise that's putting so much strain on these 60-year-old rules. So, where did this all start? Well, a huge turning point was the Challenger disaster back in 1986. That tragedy pushed the U.S. to change its policy. It moved towards what it called a mixed fleet approach, which basically just cracked the door open for private companies to start competing for government launch contracts. That right there was the spark that lit the commercial fire. And today, that spark is an absolute inferno. You've got giants like SpaceX, who are totally changing the game with reusable rockets. You have the United Launch Alliance, which is a team-up of the old-school titans, Boeing and Lockheed Martin. And then you have companies like Northrop Grumman creating whole new markets, like servicing satellites while they're still in orbit. So this leads to a really big question, right? The original treaty says space is supposed to be for the benefit and interest of all countries. But when the most powerful, dominant private companies are pretty much all from one single nation, you have to ask, does that concentration of power and wealth really line up with that original vision? It's a real source of tension. Okay, so if private companies are the ones launching these rockets, who's the ref? Who's in charge here? Well, believe it or not, if you look at the Outer Space Treaty, the answer is still the same, the state. Each country has to authorize and keep a close eye on everything its private companies do in space. Let me give you a quick look at how that actually works in the US. A company can't just, go light the candle on a rocket. First, the FAA has to give them a license to make sure the launch is safe for everyone on the ground. Then the FCC has to get involved to manage all the radio frequencies for communications. It's a whole multi-step process. And don't think this is just a bunch of paperwork. This system has real teeth. Get this. In 2018, a company called Swarm Technologies launched these super tiny satellites, even after the FCC told them no, because they were worried the satellites were too small to track. Well, the FCC found out and, boom, slapped them with a pretty hefty fine. It's a perfect example of a country actually doing its job to supervise. But there's a potential loophole here, and it's a big one. What if a company decides, you know what, the rules in the US are too tough? What's to stop them from going state shopping, looking for another country with weaker laws to launch from? This is a problem in shipping law called flags of convenience, and it's a major worry for the future of keeping space safe. All right, so we've talked a lot about getting up there. But what about when things go wrong and stuff starts coming down? And I mean coming down when it's not supposed to. This brings us to the whole messy issue of liability. Let's just make it personal for a second. Imagine a satellite from some other country comes crashing down right into your backyard. Who pays for the damage? Who pays for the cleanup? It's a great question, and believe it or not, the law actually has a very specific answer. Okay, so here's the key. It all comes down to where the damage happens. If a space object hits the surface of the Earth, or even a plane in the air, that's called absolute liability. The country that launched it is automatically on the hook, no questions asked. But if two satellites collide way up in orbit, it's different. That's called fault-based liability, where you have to actually prove that other guy was at fault. And this whole idea of absolute liability isn't just a theory. It was put to a massive real-world test back in 1978. A Soviet satellite, Cosmos 954, and you're not going to believe this, it had a nuclear reactor on board. It malfunctioned and came tumbling out of the sky, scattering radioactive debris all over a huge part of northern Canada. So Canada pointed to the rulebook, the Liability Convention, and after some diplomatic back and forth, the Soviet Union paid Canada $3 million Canadian dollars to cover the cleanup. This case was a huge deal. It proved to the whole world that these international space laws weren't just nice ideas on paper. They had real financial consequences. All right, on to our next big headache. And this one kind of blurs the very definition of what space even is. See, we have one set of laws for the air and a totally separate set of laws for space. But what do you do with these new vehicles for space tourism that operate in both realms? They take off like a plane, pop into space for a few minutes, and then land again. Where do they fit? And this is where you see the fundamental clash. Air law is all based on the idea that a nation has complete and total sovereignty over the airspace above its territory. It's theirs. But space law is the complete opposite. It says space is a global commons that belongs to everybody and to nobody. You can see how these two legal systems are just totally incompatible. So the obvious question is, where does air stop and space begin? Well, most scientists will point you to something called the Kármán line, about 100 kilometers up. But here's the kicker, and it's a big one. That boundary isn't officially recognized in international law. It's a scientific guideline, not a legal one. And that creates this giant gray area for all these suborbital flights. And this legal murkiness extends to the people on board, too. A classic astronaut, as we said, is legally considered an envoy of mankind with all these special protections. But a space tourist? Well, they're legally classified as something else entirely. In the US, they're called spaceflight participants. The rights are mostly governed by national laws and the liability waivers they have to sign. And that brings us to our final section, looking ahead. You know, the core challenge is actually pretty clear. We are trying to apply laws that were designed for just a handful of countries in the 1960s to a new space age that is bustling, crowded, and overwhelmingly commercial. From the risk of flags of convenience, to the legal status of space tourists, to the fact that we don't even have a defined border between air and space, it really feels like our old legal maps are struggling to chart this new territory. So I'll leave you with this thought to chew on. As this new generation of private companies races for the stars, are our global laws truly ready for the journey ahead?